Welcome, everyone. My name is April Doss. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the latest installment of our ongoing virtual symposium series on AI governance that's co-hosted by the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy and the Yale Information Society Project. Today's panel is talking about the geopolitics of Chinese AI. We have an absolute all-star lineup. The conversation is going to be moderated by Anupam Chander, who's the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Law and Technology here at Georgetown. And our distinguished panelists include Simon Chesterman, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore and Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore, Jeffrey Ding, Postdoctoral Fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, Kendra Schaefer, Partner and Head of Tech Policy Research at Trivium China, and Samm, Senior Fellow at Yale Law School, Paul Tsai China Center, and New America. So once again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. And Anupam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, April. It's my honor to moderate this conversation and to have the opportunity to talk with such leading scholars across the world. We have a truly international panel with people in all time zones, and I'm especially grateful for the folks in Beijing and Singapore to log in very late into the evening. And I'm also grateful to Jeff Ding for logging in very early in the morning. So this is, thanks to all of you. And Sam, of course, thank you for logging in even from the East Coast and joining us. So let's begin. In 2021, after a 2-year study and a 700-page report, the US National Security Commission on AI declared that, quote, within the next decade, China could surpass the US as the world's AI superpower. If there's an AI race between the US and China, one might expect that countries would be racing to beef up their largest internet enterprises as national champions. Instead, what we see are both the United States and China cracking down on big tech. In fact, Chinese internet companies lost some $1 trillion in market cap in 2021 as a result of Chinese government regulations and enforcement actions with respect to data. So as I've said, today we have some of the leading experts in Chinese AI regulation joining us to explain what's going on and to appraise it. So I'm going to begin with Kendra Schaefer. As April mentioned, Kendra is a partner at the strategic advisory consultancy Trivium China. She's in Beijing. She's not planning to attend the Beijing Olympic Games for various reasons. Thanks for staying up so late, Kendra. Kendra, there is a flurry of activity in Beijing around AI and algorithms. Can you bring us up to speed?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let me say the requisite hellos. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here with all of you. Many of this panel includes several of my AI policy heroes, so it's a great honor to be on it. To answer your question and to get right into it, I think it would probably be easier to answer the question of what isn't going on in China tech policy and AI regulation. Right, 2021. As most of you probably know, was just a fast and furious year for China's tech companies. They got fire hosed with a raft of regulations on data security, anti-monopoly, IPOs, online content, games, education. It was kind of like, Beijing decided to tackle every problem they'd ever had with the internet sector all at once at the same time, right? And many of the problems that China was kind of tackling are age-old issues, but some of them are quite new. Right in the middle of this barrage, in the middle of the year, we started to hear policymakers talking about algorithms and how internet companies were using algorithms, right? Scattered references to algorithmic control started appearing in a couple of anti-monopoly policies, in a couple of pricing policies, in a couple of labor policies, and we thought, oh, that's interesting. And then in late August, China's cyberspace watchdog, the CAC, released a draft of, groundbreaking new rules for recommendation algorithms. Those rules just passed a couple of weeks ago. They've been finalized, and they will come into effect in early March. And the rules specifically target algorithms that take user data and then make some kind of recommendation with the data that they collect, right? So, or some kind of decision. So that might be search, it might be e-commerce, it could be social, it could be setting prices online, it could be labor dispatching, right? Data is collected, a recommendation or decision is made, right? This is the types of algorithms that China wants to regulate. And I don't think I'm overstating the case when I say the draft was astounding. It was a world first. And when I read it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is the moment that China's data regulation surpasses the rest of the world. This is it. This is the singularity for China tech policy. And what's so astonishing about it is that, of course, it includes a lot of the tightening of online content control we've come to expect from Beijing, right? It requires that any news organization that's using algorithms to distribute content, or social media platforms that are using algorithms to distribute content, have to register those algorithms with the cyberspace watchdog, right? It requires that algorithms, when the algorithm service provider is told to stop distributing a certain kind of content, they have to immediately stop distributing that content, right? So a tightening of control over the spread of information. It also includes some references to socialist core values. It requires that algorithms actively spread positive energy, right? And that algorithms adhere, and this is a direct quote, adhere to mainstream value orientation. Right. And the question, of course, is, well, who decides what those things are? So that's the kind of stuff we would expect out of an algorithm policy in Beijing. But that is not all that was in there. There was also a huge set of rules that were really world first, and that really set an example for Europe and for the United States. Really actionable things like requirements. You have to inform users in a conspicuous way if algorithms are being used to serve them content. You also have to allow users to opt out of being targeted with algorithmic content and just see generic search results. You have to show users the keywords that are being used to target them, right? That stuff is world changing. It seems small, but it's actually quite dynamic. And then there was also a specific stipulation against generating fake news, specific stipulations about not using algorithms to exploit ride-hailing drivers or delivery drivers. So that's kind of stuff I think most people can get behind. And the fact that China kind of came out and did that before the rest of the world did was quite groundbreaking, and we're about to see them implement. So I'll stop there and let somebody else talk. But that's what blew my mind last year.
Thanks, Kendra. That's, it is mind-blowing. I totally agree. And there are aspects of this. So I did a talk a couple weeks ago at a UK workshop, just virtually, and I did a little quiz asking, taking a provision out of one of the algorithmic, this latest algorithmic regulation from China. And I said, which country is this provision come from? And 85% of the folks got it wrong. And so they all assumed it came from out of Europe and not China. And so, there's, I think, you've set this up really well, which is, obviously kind of locking down control in various ways, but also kind of expanding rights at the same time in interesting ways, and protecting against some of the excesses of algorithms in their own way. So fascinating. So I love the Fast and Furious reference here. So Kendra describes, Fast and Furious episode 13 or whatever it is, a Beijing drift. Jeff, I want to turn to you. Jeff is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford. And he writes the China AI newsletter on Substack, which I very much encourage all of you to subscribe. I'm confident that all of the participants here subscribe to that newsletter. So he notes that on the newsletter, he notes that China's president, Xi Jinping, has talked about how AI is the fourth industrial revolution after the ones in electrification, mechanization, and computers. which of this dazzling set of regulatory activities are you paying the most attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question, Anupam. And yeah, thanks, Kendra, for that overview. I learned a lot about some provisions that I didn't look deeply into, and it seems like this could be a really major turning point. For me, yeah, these new regulations are building off of past ones as well, including stuff that Samm has written a lot about, like the personal information protection law, data security law. And I don't think it's one set of regulations. I think it's this general approach to ensuring there's not too much public backlash to AI and these algorithms, and sort of this governance regime is very much driven by, I think we've seen a lot of cases of public backlash towards intrusive applications of facial recognition, from like people being forced to like wear motorcycle helmets into real estate offices because they were worried about, you know, being tracked by facial recognition cameras, and that story going viral. And even like party channels, you know, publishing big documentaries about facial recognition going too far. So I think this very much is responsive to sort of backlash against intrusive algorithms. So I'd say the geostrategic implications for me of this type of regulation is, Anupam, when you set it up in the beginning, you were saying that this regulation is wiping out market value of the big tech companies. And if you think about geopolitical competition between the US and China in the space as only about the big tech companies and the big frontier firms, you might say, hey, maybe this regulation will be counterproductive. But for me, if you think about technological competition more through the lens of who can sustainably diffuse AI, automation, and these new algorithms throughout the entire economy, from the frontier firms to all the small firms. And also, if you think of this as a long game where it's going to take decades for AI and some of these new revolutionary advances to diffuse, then maybe these set of regulations could be the first step towards like more sustained acceptance and a more sustainable development of AI in China.
I love the idea of sustainability of AI regulation generally, of deploying AI throughout our lives. It's a fascinating lens into this. Jeff raised Sam's important work on Chinese regulation, including Chinese data privacy laws, which are also coming fast and furious. Samm, as April mentioned, is a cyber policy fellow at New America and also a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. She is really the go-to expert on Chinese tech here in the United States. How do you see what's happening in China? What should we make of this?
Thank you for the really kind introduction, Anupam. And I'm lucky to go after Jeff and Kendra because I think that it makes my job easier and if they've covered some great material. So I think I want to make 2 points because my work focuses, Kendra mentioned that a lot of these algorithmic recommendations are getting at sort of how data is used to make recommendations and decisions. And so my work really focuses on the data layer of this. And one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is, although in the last 6 months, yes, we have seen a spate of moves that are fast and furious, when it comes to the build out of China's data protection regime, that is actually not fast and furious, but actually reflects a legislative process that has been underway for at least half a decade, coming off of the scaffolding that was established by the cybersecurity law, which took effect in 2017. And that pivotal piece of legislation is in many ways the framework for many of the pieces now we are seeing come out around data, right? So the personal information protection law, the data security law, the spate of regulations and standards around data are really building off of a foundation and a legislative process that dates back at least to the writing of China's cybersecurity law half a decade ago. And what's happening here is I think we're beginning to see the leadership grapple with a debate about data ownership that has been underway for some time. And that debate still really exists. And Kendra and I have done a lot of work on this question specifically of, in these laws, we see another tension. And I love how Kendra teed up the idea of both control and rights. And you see those same tensions in China's data regime as well. And so, Kendra and I have looked at this dichotomy where I think the leadership is grappling with data has been identified as a strategic economic resource, which is vital to fuel the digital economy, and AI is such a part of that. But it also is seen as a security vulnerability. And so how is the leadership going to figure out what kind of data needs to be able to circulate to fuel the digital economy and be part of these applications that I think the aspiration is not just to have a sort of China be a leader in AI governance from a domestic standpoint, but to Kendra's point, that really stepping up in global leadership on this issue. And if the data security rules are too onerous from a security perspective, that will then inhibit or hamper that innovation in AI. And how do they do that? And so one of the things we've seen has been an attempt to classify data assets. But also I'm observing a debate play out in the Chinese bureaucracy between ministries that are much more security focused. So CAC, obviously the security apparatus, but then you have others that are thinking about how can China be embedded in the global trade and digital economy system. And so going too far will inhibit that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these tensions are very much visible as we look at the new actions that are taking place. The second point I want to make is specifically about children. And Anupam, I love your point about how if you look at some of these rules that are coming out, but you do it blind, you don't know what the country is, it's really, it's very possible to go, oh, wow, there's some really amazing things going on here, right? And so I thought it was extraordinary to watch, for example, the congressional hearings this fall around the Facebook whistleblower and all of the attention in the US right now about algorithmic harms. And so the impact of social media in pushing content to minors and to teens and the impact on mental health. And if you look at some of the specific measures that Kendra mentioned in these algorithmic recommendations, they are making a specific attempt to address the very harms to children online that I think we're very concerned about in the US and are trying to grapple with what to do about in the context of our own political system and how you think about free speech. So the idea that you could have a government or a party deciding what is, a healthy morality for children online would clearly run into obstacles here. And I would love to hear from those of you who follow this more from a US perspective, what that looks like. But at this moment, the algorithmic management recommendations are very much grappling with those kinds of mental health harms that I think we are front and center here, and we haven't figured out what to do about it.
I love the idea that Beijing is listening to Frances Haugen and acting upon Frances Haugen before Washington is. That is a pretty amusing possibility. So Simon, let me come to you. Simon has a great new book out. I've started reading it. I haven't finished it yet, Simon, but it's fantastic. I want to get to the later chapters where you actually talk about how various the international aspects of this. So I haven't gotten to that chapter yet. But Simon is the Dean and Provost Chair at National University of Singapore, Faculty of Law. He's also the editor of the Asian Journal of International Law. His new book is We, the Robots, Regulating AI and the Limits of the Law, just out from Cambridge just in the last couple of months. And so Simon, as a director of the AI Singapore initiative, where you have a particular vantage point on Chinese AI, what's your perspective in all this?
Thanks, Anupam. Thanks for the plug about the book, which I now realize is already out of date. So I've got more work to do, particularly on the China angle. No, thanks. And really, it's a pleasure to be on this panel. And my only request that I go last, so that, like the rest of you, I could learn a lot from this. And I think from the perspective in Singapore, I mean, Singapore as a small jurisdiction is a kind of rule taker in this area. And so one of the things that we've been doing is precisely looking around the world. And maybe I'll try and situate what we've been discussing in the context of China in the larger context of debates around the world on how to govern this new technology in a way that enables us to get the benefits while mitigating or minimizing the risks. And essentially, when you approach any kind of regulatory question, there are two basic reasons why you regulate, either to address market failures, to make the market function efficiently, or in support of social or other values, whether or not they help the market. And what's really striking is to see China pivot from the first to the latter. That in the early days of China's views of regulation, as Sam was just saying, I mean, this is not new, but I mean, half a decade is not that long ago. 2016, I think, was when China made AI a national priority. And back then they were using the language, I think in the 2017 strategy that, okay, we want AI governance, we want rules by 2025. And that was to avoid the fear in some jurisdictions that over-regulation will inhibit innovation. And so there was a desire to really promote AI, to encourage technology companies. But as has just been outlined by the panel before me, that's changed very quickly over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, back in 2019, you had the Ministry of Science and Technology's Principles for AI Governance, also a pretty light touch on AI regulation. But really, as Kendra was outlining at the top of the discussion, 2021 was a banner year for AI regulation. And you saw China, I mean, I think one of the most important things to understand about China is it's a huge country and it's not a monolith. There are these sort of debates, different perspectives within the different ministries. But you've seen regulation for at least kind of 3 different purposes. You've seen regulation, candidly, for political reasons, reining in some of the technology companies because they were getting a bit too powerful, a bit too full of themselves, a bit too ahead of the curve in terms of the politics. And some technology entrepreneurs in particular got kind of reined back in. You've seen regulation for social reasons. And this goes to this point about morality. I think around the world, many parents, I've got teenage children, were thinking, wow, limits on video games, that's a pretty good thing. Then the kids don't blame me for limiting their screen time, they blame President Xi. Also limits on tuition, things like that. In that larger context of social regulation, as I think Sam was implying, the kind of rules that would be difficult, if not impossible, to impose in a jurisdiction like the United States. But also regulation for more explicit economic reasons, in addition to the political and social. The desire, and I think Kendra's written on this in the past, for the digital economy to be more than just a parasite on the real or physical economy. And this most recent effort on algorithms is extremely interesting. I mean, you were pointing out the costs at the outset, Anupam, this sort of $1 trillion. And again, that's striking that if you think of these two purposes of regulation as facilitating a market or protecting certain values, China has clearly decided that it's worth that $1 trillion, that's a price worth paying, or at least it's a price the company's worth paying. One of the key questions, and maybe this is something we can move on to, is where I think Kendra ended, and Jeff was touching on, what's all this going to mean in practice? Because a lot of these rules, I mean, China recently signed on to the UNESCO principles saying, oh yes, real-time biometric surveillance, any kind of social scoring, these are terrible things that should never be done, which is integral to much of Chinese policy, on at least policy for the government on AI at present. So yeah, I'm particularly interested in what's going to happen as theory goes to practice, but it's very much against type. And I really like the idea of like a blind taste test. You present a regulation and say which country is adopting this, and it is really striking that some of the most sort of rights positive initiatives are presently coming out of China, although I'm curious to see what they will actually mean when the rubber hits the road, if you want to continue your fast and furious metaphor.
So Simon, that's all wonderful. And by the way, I'm doing a whole quiz that I'm going to do for my Global Tech Reg seminar students for this coming week. That's going to be the first class that they have. I'm going to quiz them on where this regulation is from. So this morning I saw that EU announced a domain name, a new DNS system, which is exactly, where would I expect that coming from? I'd say Russia, China. I wouldn't have expected it to come out of the EU. So lots of oddities if we're blind to where something was coming from, and kind of unexpected finds, but also kind of expected finds, including more political control. I love your, political, cultural, or political, social, and economic concerns that are motivating all this. So I'm going to come back to you, Kendra. So we saw Simon saying this is motivated by a bunch of different reasons. One of the reasons that's often mentioned in China and in Beijing explaining this is common prosperity. And we saw Jeff mentioning, kind of sustainable AI implementation. Is this about increased state control, which you mentioned at the start? Is it about common prosperity? Is it about both, or is it about something else?
Gosh, wouldn't it be easy if there was one single motivating factor driving all of these things? It's really, as everyone has said, I agree with everybody on the panel, it is a massive confluence of issues. One of the things we do at Trivium is help investors and governments understand how Beijing is thinking about this stuff. And we've got just a giant list, which we keep adding to, about, motivations behind all of this regulation. One of the big top line concerns, of course, is social stability. That's where a lot of this content control regulation comes from, right? Beijing sees what's happened in the US in terms of the polarization of US politics, and they go, nope, we're noping right out of that. We're noping right out of that early, right? We maintain our power by maintaining stability. And so that's a top line concern. There's also lots of concerns about just plain old legal compliance. I mean, a lot of these platform companies grew up in an era where they were not being regulated very closely. And so they have gotten used to using algorithms and kind of doing whatever they want, frankly, flouting the law, and shrugging off the fines and the consequences. And Beijing is just sick of it. They've had enough. They want to move, as a couple of pundits over on this side of the line have said, from a period of barbaric growth to a period of compliant growth. That's your sustainability right there. It's actually really interesting when you think about things like Didi, China's ride hailer, only has a ride compliance rate right now of 40 to 60% nationally. That means that only about half of rides taken in Didi cars are legally compliant. The driver has a license, he's allowed to be driving in that area, right? So, that gives you a sense of how companies just kind of brush off regulations that have been around for a while. And so part of this crackdown, the world says crackdown, China says reform, right? Reform. So part of it's compliance. Part of it, as Samm said, is social issues, right? There are concerns about how delivery drivers are being treated by algorithms, by platform companies, big outcry there. Concerns from parents about what content minors are seeing online. There are data security issues underpinning this, right? China's become aware that data security is a massive concern. That has become a top 5 national priority, is securing data. But even more interesting, I think, is that Beijing's definition of innovation is changing, right? Innovation used to just mean making new stuff, right? Doing something on the forefront of any kind of tech. But in 2010, a VC investor named Mi Lei kind of floated the idea that soft tech, that platform companies are not innovative, that they focus on taking existing technologies and scaling them, right, from 1 to 100. And that real innovation, right, is going from 0 to 1. It's about creating something where nothing was before. And the companies doing that are companies like AI firms and chip manufacturers, right? All of these kind of core breakthrough technologies that Beijing really wants to see. And those are also the core breakthrough technologies that the US is currently imposing sanctions on Chinese companies around, right? And so part of the issue here is, Beijing is looking to encourage its platform companies and its traditional AI companies to help break US chokeholds by developing AI. And so there's a little bit of a push from the government to kind of restructure the way that funding and R&D and investment works, so that those companies, I mean, the basic idea is, hey, listen, we don't want you guys like disrupting the laundry industry. It's not what we need right now. We need you guys to take your wealth, your power, use it for the common good, also use it for the state good. So that's another reason, right? Getting tech companies to take up the mantle of state goals. So it's just such an incredible confluence of reasons. It's such an incredible confluence of motivations. And I think that's why some of this stuff, when you look at it from the outside, just looks so incredibly tangled and confusing. You have a lot of stakeholders trying to push their agenda at the same time, essentially.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kendra. Jeff, I'm going to come back to you. So Kai-Fu Lee, as you know, argues that we are in the implementation stage of AI, with the big theoretical innovations behind us, what Kendra described as 0 to 1 innovation, I guess. We hear that China's big advantage in AI is having not just big data, but the biggest data. What do you make of that claim?
Yeah, I think first of all, some of the stuff that we've seen about like data protection legislation, regulations, if China thinks it's just about who has the most data is going to win at the end of the day, you'd think these sort of regulations are irrational, right? So Chinese leadership obviously has a more nuanced view of, it's not just about who has the most data. The term we often see thrown around is that China is the Saudi Arabia of data. And I think there's a lot of differences between data and oil, first of which is data is much more fungible and transferable. So the whole point of a lot of the data economy is that one data set can be used by so many different actors. You can only use one fuel tank for one purpose, or one actor can only use one fuel tank. And the other key difference I want to emphasize here is that a lot of times our focus on data is about the biggest data set. Maybe I think the assumption there is just who has the most people, and maybe there's something about like mobile internet data and information, and some of those, having the most mobile data doesn't translate to other fields of AI, like autonomous vehicles. And in a lot of those areas, we're actually seeing synthetic data and the creation of synthetic data as kind of a key advantage point for a lot of these companies. So, there's a lot to complicate there on that story. One thing I wanted to expand on in terms of what we've been talking about, that Kendra was also talking about, is the operability of these laws and protections. And I think not only the long time frame, not only the political factors of operability, but also just basic implementation questions, like, do government actors have the technical capacity to answer and distinguish between some really hard questions, like what level of encryption will we apply to protect sensitive facial information data? Other questions, like when you're registering algorithms, we were talking about earlier, how do you actually assess the impact of these algorithms? We know that there's all these complicated second order effects of algorithms. Whenever I buy a flight, I'm searching in incognito mode because I know that they're tracking my browsing history potentially, right? And so how would you predict some of these actual second order impacts of these algorithms? And who's in charge at the end of the day of sort of handling all these different algorithms? Is it at the provincial level? There's all these different bureaucratic offices fighting over control, as Kendra was alluding to. So yeah, in terms of the future, I'm really interested in what other people on this panel and other people in the audience are thinking about how these regulations will actually become operable from both a technical perspective and also from a bureaucratic perspective.
So I'm mindful of time, and so I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience right now. And my colleague and extremely well-known scholar Julie Cohen asks a question. I'm going to shorten her question just because of the time constraints that we have. Here she asks, might portions of the Chinese AI law offer an inspiration for efforts to design publicly accountable tech regulation? And or if Western observers pigeonhole the entire law as an effort at authoritarian control, do we risk overlooking those portions? Sam, I want to turn to you first.
I have an anecdote to share, which is a colleague of mine submitted an article to a publication that I will not name, basically saying, could China be a regulatory laboratory to observe what happens when governments try to push forward actions around harms that we in the United States are grappling with? And the feedback from this unnamed publication was, given China's authoritarian political model, I don't think there's anything that US can learn about regulation. And I think this is an extremely dangerous position. The fact that a major outlet is not accepting an article based on that premise, right? And I think this is something that I'm really happy that this panel has grappled with, because yes, I do think that there are things to learn. And the question is, how do we do that in a smart way that doesn't sort of breaks away from the authority? And in the Biden administration right now too, there's such an emphasis on creating coalitions of democracies around technology, internet, data governance. And I think that, and working just with like-minded governments to do that. And I understand the impetus for it. And I don't want to devalue the importance of criticism and holding China's authoritarian model accountable in ways where there are real harms connected to that. That's not my intent. But I think we're in an environment now, we're creating this dichotomy between authoritarian and democratic technology is very dangerous in terms of looking at these issues around how do we govern emerging technologies that really grapple with the questions rather than just sort of reverting back to this AI race between two systems. And I think that is actually incredibly dangerous as we grapple with questions around governance of technology that are actually so much bigger.
Thanks very much, Sam. And that leads me to a question that I have that I want to ask to the panel. So I could see US efforts to deny Chinese firms access to US technologies as having two possible effects. First, hampering their development, the goal of those rules. Consider what happened to Huawei in the last year, or alternatively, supercharging the development of Chinese tech as the Chinese government and corporations double down on developing indigenous alternatives, not subject to such sanctions. I wanted to see what you guys thought about that. Is that a risk that we face from these kind of export controls? Kendra, I'm going to come to you first. What are you seeing from Beijing's response, or the country's response to our export sanctions on technology?
That's actually, I'm kind of glad you asked, because I've noticed some changes on that. I mean, in the last couple of years, it's been hard to see what the real ramifications have been, especially given the fact that, let's take semiconductors, for example, because that's probably the clearest one to tackle. U.S. has imposed sanctions on China, on Chinese companies buying U.S. semiconductors. They've gone out of their way to make it difficult for the U.S. for China to procure semiconductors from allied nations. And what we're starting to see over here is that Beijing has responded by, as you say, supercharging their support of the semiconductor industry. Now, China's a long way away from being able to make fancy schmancy chips. They're making mostly low quality chips right now, but here's what has started to happen. It used to be that only a couple of big firms that were focused on semiconductor design were making semiconductors. And now the policy has switched. They have said everybody has to make semiconductors. So they want big tech to do it. They've, are pushing really hard for Alibaba to get into the game, Tencent's getting into the game. They have also started focusing on developing SMEs that are specialized in one specific kind of chip. So, we want a host of smaller companies that are just making one specific, auto chip for braking or something like that. And then they're also looking at, pushing money into universities and connecting universities to the market more closely, including policies like giving incentives to researchers that go join SMEs in their R&D departments. Right. So making sure that SMEs that want to get into this stuff have access to top tier talent and they can afford them and they can find them, and that those researchers, are facilitated to go. So, none of this is guaranteed to solve the problem. And we won't know for a decade if China solved the problem or not, right? They're a decade behind on some of this stuff. But certainly these moves would not have occurred, right, if China hadn't been subject to such sanctions. And when the wheel of China's economy starts grinding down a specific path, they often get where they're going, as we've seen in the last 40 years. And so, it's certainly something to consider, and it's certainly something to be concerned about.
Yeah, just to watch Huawei's growth actually over the last 20 years, from emulator to innovator, is really remarkable, right? So 20 years ago, I think they'd have been dismissed as simply doing low-level emulation, and today they're at the leading edge, right? So I think that is an important point. So my student Jay Wang asked the question, and I always give priority to my students. Vladimir Putin, he notes, writes, the nation that leads in the AI race will be the ruler of the world. Apparently, this is Putin's claim. Does this panel agree with that statement? Any takers on that question? I'd come to you, Simon. Actually, you have a very interesting vantage point on this whole question.
Sure. I mean, it's very clear, and it goes back to your sort of fourth industrial revolution framing. It's clear that AI is going to be a transformative technology. It'll permeate every industry. I mean, one of the questions implicit in that sort of AI leadership will lead the world is who will maintain control over the AI. And that's one of the challenges as we kind of think about AI governance. At the moment, we're talking primarily about the reasons why markets are regulated, why the political, social objectives. But there is also underlying this a non-trivial risk associated with some of these technologies. And I mean, one of the things that's striking is almost the same time that China started thinking about these things, and we're talking about the period 2016 onwards, that was the same time that many people in the West started realizing that we needed something more than Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And you had this sort of flood of ethics, principles, guides, frameworks, hundreds of them. I think a year and a half ago, the Pope endorsed one. And what coincided in that period was both the development of machine learning and various applications, but also the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the realization that AI run amok didn't just mean an autonomous vehicle might kill a pedestrian or you'd be subject to identity theft or something, but it could switch an election, change the history of the world potentially. So I think certainly AI is a powerful tool, but one of the reasons we talk about regulation is to make sure that there is a hand on that tool to ensure that it's used for proper purposes. And that to me is one of the interesting questions about China in particular, where you have a very strong state. I mean, until recently, we would have maybe by caricature talked about different approaches to regulation, with the Europeans had their rights-based approach, the Americans very much focused on free market, and China, it was state sovereignty, national security. And we saw that in the context of data protection. So the European Brussels effect on data protection, America doesn't really have a federal data protection law, and China, a lot of the discussion was about data localization. So I think we all realize that AI is a tremendous tool. It's going to transform economies. It'll have major impact on politics. So I think there's an element of truth to what Putin is saying, but it presumes that the leader in AI still has the ability to ensure that AI is serving the larger interests of the state rather than undermining it. And I think that's one of the things that China is grappling with right now, to try and make sure they get those benefits, but they're prepared to take big economic hits to ensure that the political, social, cultural, other objectives are not being undermined, at least in the view of the state.
Fascinating point. Yeah. So let me turn to a question that Mark McCarthy asks. Mark is a scholar here at Georgetown. Kendra, can you elaborate on the very recent proposals for algorithmic dispatching and workers' rights? And so what's going on with ride hailing and other, not just ride hailing, but delivery workers and all those kinds of, regulations that we're seeing with respect to algorithms?
Yeah, so basically the fundamental concept, those algorithm rules I outlined right in the beginning say very briefly that algorithms cannot be used to exploit laborers, essentially, that you cannot impose unreasonable delivery schedules on delivery drivers or ride hailers, right? Keeping them, I mean, the subtext being keeping them in a state of extremely high intensity labor over a sustained period of time. It's exhausting, we see in Beijing, this is actually coming from something we see in Beijing all the time, which is that, the algorithm says they've got 30 minutes to get where they're going. And so workers run red lights and drive on the sidewalk and crashes and hit kids, and it just has turned into a giant mess, right? And so that's kind of an attempt to solve the problem of creating, algorithms making decisions that, yes, are optimal for the algorithm and the company, but are not optimal for human beings. And so here's the problem. How do you identify a violation has taken place? If a regulator sits down and they pick up the app and they use it, they are not a driver themselves, and therefore they cannot decide, right? And even if they were a driver on the app, one driver's experience does not speak to the overall experience that the algorithm is imposing on all drivers on the platform. So how do you create so how do you know, right? How do you know if algorithms are doing that or not? And the answer is you have to get feedback from the workers. And so what is starting to shake out is that China, the All China Federation of Trade Unions has basically said, look, trade unions are going to do it. We're going to be the intermediary and create a negotiation platform between laborers, right? We're going to create a union for gig workers in the gig economy, especially platform workers. And we are going to be the go-between, and workers will complain en masse to us when their delivery schedules are problematic or there's some other issue with the algorithm, and we will then negotiate on their behalf for the company. And when we identify a violation, we'll go to the regulators and we'll say, hey, this company, we're getting a lot of complaints. So it's just an interesting, to answer somebody's question. I think Jeff mentioned, well, how do you implement some of this stuff? China has just started to, it's nice to make rules and everything, but how do you enforce them? China's rules and sometimes are quite aspirational. They'll come up with a rule and say, we want to do this, and how they're going to do it, who knows? But this is starting to look like, for that specific topic, algorithms and ride hailing drivers or delivery drivers, couriers, freight truckers, trade unions is shaking out to be the answer. We'll see if that ends up being the case.
So we have 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a question posed by Ugonma Nwanko. Are countries that use technology created by China more likely to adopt the country's more authoritarian approach to governance? Is there a dependency created? And of course, Ugonma mentions that he's thinking, or that person is thinking, he or she, they are thinking about along the lines of African countries. Any takers on this question? Sam?
So we hear a lot about the export of China's digital authoritarian model, and I think that's a sort of one of these phrases that's worth unpacking. And I know that there are definitely, and one of the things that I'd like to just raise to kind of problematize that is, we know that China is really good at providing high performance, cheap surveillance technology. And the question is, what are the demand factors for that? Like, to what extent is the Chinese government intentionally going around and trying to find, receptive other governments who are interested in doing a copy and paste of the cyber governance regime. I'm hard pressed to find specific examples of that. I know anecdotally, there have been some reports about CAC officials, for example, hosting training seminars on the cybersecurity law. And that is important to take into account. From the same token, I think we also need to look at the other side, which is there's clearly a rising demand for surveillance technology. And to what extent are those bottom up or being pushed by the Chinese government? And I think that when you look at some of the authoritative statements coming out of the Chinese leadership, I think there's a recognition that China's governance model is pretty unique, and that it is something that works in the context of China. And while there's certainly an effort to make the world safe for autocracies, and scholars like Jessica Chen Weiss at Cornell, who's now at State Department Policy Planning Office, have written specifically about the Xi Jinping's leadership's efforts to make a world that's safe for autocracy, but that is somewhat different from a deliberate exportation of China's model, which I think they recognize is pretty unique to China. By the same token, I would say that there are demand factors for surveillance technology that the US government is also very much a part of. So look at the global war on terror. Countries in Africa were explicitly brought in to help be partners in law enforcement and intelligence efforts to help the US rout out terrorists. So there's also demand for surveillance technology that comes from the US that I think is sort of meeting a great market in which the Chinese model offers really cheap, high-performing surveillance technology. So I just think it's worth unpacking this phrase, export of digital authoritarianism, before we all kind of get on that bandwagon.
I just want to add to that because so in a paper called Sovereignty 2.0, one of the arguments we make in that paper is that, yes, China is exporting these technologies, but as Sam points out, so is the West. And so you can get facial recognition technologies. Also, obviously, to point out something that's well known to anyone who watches Chinese technology, Cisco built the Great Firewall of China. So It was our technologies in the first instance that did the deep packet inspection. We sell these technologies around the world. And if anyone's following the NSO group, they're selling these technologies all over the world.
I was about to say, and I highly recommend Nicole Perlroth's book I'm blanking on the title of it now, but there's some really important sections in Nicole Perlroth's book about former NSA employees going to North African countries to help them build out their own versions of NSA, specifically the use of surveillance that's then used to crack down on dissidents and human rights advocates in Africa. And this is sort of being built out by NSA employees. So I just think this is a lot more complicated a picture.
Yeah, so none of that is to license what China is doing in these places. That's not my goal. But also, first physician, heal thyself is a mantra, and I think we need to be in a better position to. And so I'm very glad to see the Biden administration at least taking a step towards the NSO, but not as significant a step as it took against Huawei, for example. I mean, it's there are different gradations in what levels of sanctions we've taken against various technology players. Anyway, okay, so let's, I'm going to give kind of closing words. I'm going to begin with Simon. Closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating topic. We'll be talking about it for years. I mean, I suppose just one other thought on China, particularly with my sort of lawyer hat on, is in terms of the legitimacy of the state, one of the interesting things is that China has been experimenting in using AI in legal systems in a way that would be very difficult to implement elsewhere. So you've had really interesting experiments in China, in the Hangzhou Internet Court, the Supreme People's Court, using predictive judgments, one-click judgments in some places. And to me, that does point to one of the challenges in extrapolating from the Chinese model elsewhere, because there is a Supreme People's Court, there is a legal system in China, but it's all underneath the party. And so that instrumental view of the rule of law as being in service of the state rather than a restraint on the state, I think should give us at least pause, even as we regard what we've been talking about as a really interesting set of experiments in China. I'm not sure about the laboratory metaphor, but I do think we want to be cautious about assuming how easy it would be to extrapolate that from other systems, from China into other systems. But it's a topic we'll be talking about, I'm sure, for decades to come.
Kendra?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about this going forward that we're going to have to grapple with over the next 20 or 30 years is when Simon brought this up, when, I compared China's or the Ministry of Science and Technology's AI ethics guidelines against the ethical guidelines that were released by the EU. Or, they're almost identical. China's got 9 of them. The EU's got 8 of them, something like that. And the words that they're using are almost identical, right? These very big, very pretty words both say support human rights, both say, autonomy, both say, protecting individual liberties, both say, safety. What do those words mean? Right. The problem isn't really when we are trying to formulate a global governance model for AI, we have to get more specific. This kumbaya language does not serve anybody's ultimate interest, which is to get everybody on the same page. But the definitions and the way those words are formulated in different places is really, really different. China's definition of human rights is more focused on the right to survive, the right to have a house or the roof over your head and food to eat, right, and clean water. And so if you formulate human rights this way, you get into these arguments where, right, both countries sign on to multiple countries sign on to a UNESCO pledge, including China, and everybody goes, China, you're not meeting your obligations right away. You've signed that in bad faith. And so I think that, and China goes, excuse me, what are you talking about? We do all of those things. And they really believe that, right? They really say, okay, we really do all of these things by our definition and our viewpoint on these things. And so I think that really, as we move forward, we're going to have to sort out specific definitions for what we mean by AI ethics and what we mean by, right, algorithmic values. And I think that's probably going to be the next big challenge for us.
Jeff, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple points about some of the previous questions in terms of how we think about technology and politics. And going back to like, who's going to win the AI race, one thing that we do know is that we're very, very bad at technological forecasting. So I'm very open to the idea that AI actually doesn't transform societies. We thought the same thing about AI in the 1980s, and then there was an AI winter. And if we were having this panel in the 2000s, we would be talking about nanotechnology. And 20 years later, we don't really talk about nanotechnology anymore. The other thing I'll say about technology is it's not determinative of like politics and social institutions. So, an African country receiving a Chinese smart sensor might use that smart sensor in a very different way than it would have been used in a Chinese context. So I think when we talk about exporting digital authoritarianism, I think there should also be more like agency given to the receiving countries, so to speak. And the last point I'll make is, I think one of the most interesting thread lines through this conversation, going back to Julie's question, we've been talking about largely these new regulations, and I think they're a great example of what political science literature has called authoritarian responsiveness. So the ability of authoritarian governments to actually develop some sort of public accountability measures, in the words of Julie's question, that you would expect in a democratic society. So you see public backlash to some of these systems, and then you see the government responding. I think what's worrisome for me, or like things that might be different in an authoritarian context, two things we haven't really touched on, and I think could be things to think about in the future. One is, how does this spill over to things like government surveillance, where the authoritarian government has this very core interest in mind, right? So you see some discussions where these regulations might be a preventative measure to make sure that the public's attention doesn't go towards government surveillance next. And there's even been talks about like a draft facial recognition law in the future. And the second thing is, maybe authoritarian governments are good at responding to the masses or preventing collective action, but they might not be as responsive to very marginalized groups. So would we ever see any regulation against ethnic profiling of facial recognition algorithms in China? Would this ever extend to that sphere? And that's something that is really, really relevant as well. So those are, I don't have the answers to those questions, but two open questions that I think this really great discussion has sparked for me.
Sam, I'm going to give you the last word.
I don't want to attempt to sum up all of these great comments, so I'm going to respectfully decline the last word, but thank you.
Sure. So let me just thank everyone. It's, this is a very, I think, a kind of dangerous moment in its own way, because there's so much concern about how each country is racing ahead and worry that the other country is racing, is becoming the superpower in AI, et cetera. I began with the kind of report saying China might overtake the US as an AI superpower. And that assumes that that is a bad thing. And so, it's not clear to me that necessarily that's a bad thing. Obviously, we're talking about military advantage and military uses. I can see that being a concern, but I would think, given the global pandemic we've all just we're living in, we want the world to have the strongest technologies. And, I'm happy that China's scientists are producing amazing technologies, and I hope that they keep on doing so. So that I'll just say that from my perspective, and hopefully we can all learn from each other in this process. Of course, as Jeff points out, facial recognition systems that identify you by ethnicity and then are deployed to disadvantage particular ethnicities and target and surveil particular ethnicities is extremely alarming. And so we need regulations that focus on these things. And so I'm glad that many people are concerned about this and are challenging this. But I also encourage us, as we point the finger at China, rightly so, and Chinese companies, to worry about our own companies and what they are doing in this process as well, and to make sure that that kind of, the harmful aspects are more properly cabined. So thank you all for an incredible conversation. It's an honor to have this. Kendra, do you want to say anything else?
No, I was getting ready to say my goodbyes.
Okay, great. So thank you all, and please, I'm going to turn the podium back to April Doss.
Thanks, Anupam. Thanks, everyone.
I think April's having some connectivity issues. Thank you all so much.
On behalf of both the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy and the Yale Information Society Project, thank you to everybody. Thank you to this excellent panel. Thank you for your contributions, and also thank you to the audience for tuning in. This is an ongoing series, so please join us again. Our next session will be on February 25th. 10 a.m. Eastern time, and we will be talking about the geopolitics of European AI, so the counterpart from Europe. Again, thank you so much. Have a good evening, night, afternoon, noon, whatever it is where you are, and thank you so much. We really appreciate your contributions.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.